Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Health Mastery Show. I'm your host, Adam McDonald. I decided to take a bit of a mini break for the last few weeks from the podcast, or at least editing the podcast, social media as well. So if you're listening to this podcast, at least when it was aired first, you would have got it or are getting it because you follow the podcast stream itself rather than me promoting it on social media. I think it's just good sometimes to just completely delete all the apps and notifications, etc., and just not use them for a bit. So that's what I'm doing. So for those listening when this comes out first, you're my true followers and I appreciate you, but I appreciate everybody that listens nonetheless. So in today's podcast, I have on with me Greg Nuckols. I really look forward to recording this podcast. We set it up sometime last year because Greg is just a fountain of knowledge when it comes to training, and that's specifically what we talked about today. We talked about the difference between training for strength and training for hypertrophy. We get into a little bit of detail and get a bit sciencey for those who enjoy that, and for those who don't enjoy it, maybe you will enjoy it. Just stick around. But I hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you do like it, please leave a rating and review. But I don't want to waste any more of your time, and let's get into this episode with Greg Nuckols. So Greg, my man, thank you for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've been really looking forward to getting you on. I've had a bit of a break from the podcast for 2 or 3 weeks now, but I really want to get you on. I've been listening to You're Stronger by Science for quite a while now. How long has that been going?
So Eric Trexler has been doing the show for about 8 months now. I'm just a occasional temporary guest host. But you know, I've been on from time to time as well, but it's been about 8 months.
So you're like a guest host on every single episode so far.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a decent streak going, but I don't want to jinx it, you know?
Yeah, but it's a great podcast, and you write really well, and as well, so in articles and stuff on your website. I was actually reading through some of your older ones. I think it was like gregnuckols.com or something. I don't know. It's a really old website.
Yeah.
But you've got some good stuff on that. I was reading stuff about the fat-free mass index, and you really delve deep into like how bad, or I suppose how limited the actual data was on that fat-free mass index. Because I see it on YouTube all the time, like, you know, natty or not, and then people using this fat-free mass index. And when you kind of broke it down into like how many people were actually in that study, and I think you mentioned something like if you're looking for the fastest person on earth, you wouldn't just go to like a few athletic clubs in the east coast of America and get like 50 people, and then that's the absolute fastest anybody could be.
Yeah, it's wild, right? Because like in that study, the inclusion criteria for the drug-free group was, if memory serves, minimum 6 months of training experience. It may have been 2 years. I think it was 6 months though. But, you know, not a ton of training experience, and minimum, I believe, 18 years old. If you met those two inclusion criteria, you were in. They had a sample of 74 drug-free, just random gym goers, split between, I think, a gym in LA and a gym in Boston. Looked at them, said, none of these guys have a fat-free mass index over 25. Therefore, it's interesting because, like, the way the authors of the study word it, they basically say this could potentially be a first screening tool, where if someone has a fat-free mass index over 25, maybe at that point it is worth like actually drug testing them. They never proposed that it was any sort of a hard limit. And within the same fucking paper, they presented data which were very sketchy. Like, they put more faith in these data than they probably should have. But looking at Mr. America winners from the time predating the invention of steroids, and like, what was it? Something like 13 out of 20 of them had a fat-free mass index over 25. So like, yeah. If anyone just pulled up the fucking full text of the study, it would be obvious that no one was ever proposing that a fat-free mass index of 25 was any sort of like hard limit that no drug-free person could ever go beyond. But like, that's the most stupid, brain-dead interpretation of that study one could possibly come up with. and therefore it is necessarily the one that the internet came up with.
Yeah.
Because that's just how it goes.
Yeah, but I suppose for YouTube, all you need is a camera and a social media presence to get your message out there. So I don't think many people actually read the research when it comes to propagating information online.
No, I mean of course they don't.
So when it comes to like exercise science, you seem like a complete nerd, not in a bad way. I suppose when I think of a nerd, I think of like computer nerd, but like a fitness nerd. You like know a lot about it, and when people think of exercise science, well, at least when I think of it, I think of you. So what is your background in that? How did you get into this, or whatever? What would you call yourself, a content creator, or I suppose at this stage?
I don't know. I don't like to self-aggrandize too much. I would call myself a coach and a blogger because that's mostly what I do.
You still coach?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, if I was writing about coaching and didn't coach anyone, I would just feel like a complete fraud. So I don't coach, like I don't have as many active clients as I used to. But yeah, I still coach several people, like just so I myself can feel better about what I'm doing. It's kind of like a bullshit check. Like if you're actually in the trenches doing something, I think it does give you a reality check if you are someone who makes content. Because, if you don't train anyone, if you want to, like, make a video or write an article, and you don't have to think, like, would I ever try this with any client ever? Or, like, what will my clients think when they read this? Like, are they going to read this and be like, this doesn't look at all like the way that I'm being trained right now. I think always having some level of skin in the game helps keep bullshit in check. So I coach people just as much for that reason as really anything else.
Yeah, I think it gives you a good perspective on things as well, like a different lens to look through. I noticed that I just came off the back of a prep there, and I pretty much dieted for like 12 months. And like most of the things that I did towards the end were not like on paper optimal, but it literally got me across the line, and I wouldn't have been able to do it. And if I wasn't somebody who was like in the trenches, I would be like, why are you doing that? It's like stupid. You should do the optimal thing, because you're gonna lose muscle, or you're gonna not have enough energy, or whatever. So I think, yeah, that makes complete sense. Do you have a background? I think you've done some level of college, a bachelor's degree in exercise science. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I have a bachelor's in exercise science, and I have a master's in exercise science as well.
Nice. And you've been pretty much interested in powerlifting all your career, right?
Yeah, I kind of got into the sport by accident. So I played football, basketball, baseball in high school. That's American football. But basketball was my main sport, and so I'm like 100 and... Would your listeners be more comfortable with inches or centimeters?
Oh, inches, I'd say. I don't really know centimeters, even though we do that. But.
Okay, so I'm like 5'9", 5'10". But I always had like a pretty good vertical, but fairly small hands. And so I couldn't palm a basketball super well, but I could dunk if I was given a perfect alley-oop. But to dunk convincingly, I needed to dunk with two hands because I had fairly small hands. And so I hired a coach to help me get my vertical up. And then... So
you're like a Nate Robinson.
Yeah, I mean, not as extreme as him. His vertical was what, like 46 inches, something crazy.
Yeah, I think he was 5'5" or something like that. Anyway.
Yeah, so I was going to say a much less extreme version, but really nothing even comparable. I think my best vertical is like 36, 37 inches. But yeah, so I wanted to get my vertical up so I could play above the rim and be able to like dunk convincingly in games. It was like purely a vanity thing, but that's what I was all about. And then at football camp, I got a really, really gnarly concussion, like to the point that there was some level of brain hemorrhaging. And the doctor said, like, hey, this is really bad. If you get another concussion this bad, you could wind up a vegetable. I was like, I don't really want that. So that kind of knocked me out of team sports. And it just so happened that the guy that I had hired to help me get my vertical up was Travis Mash, who these days is more known as a weightlifting coach. But back then, he was a power lifter and pretty much only doing powerlifting coaching, and also like sports performance coaching. But in terms of strength sports, it was pretty much all powerlifting. And so, I was bummed that I got knocked out of football and basketball, basketball especially, because that was my main sport. And he was like, it's fine, Nuckols. You like basketball, but you're better at lifting weights. So there's this other sport called powerlifting that you should check out. And so I looked into it and I was like, oh, probably won't experience any head trauma doing this unless I do something very, very wrong. So yeah, that got me into powerlifting at like 14, 15. And I've just been sticking with it ever since.
That's pretty cool. I think back in the day, maybe like 8 years ago or so, I kind of finished up playing basketball, but that was my main thing for many years as well.
Nice.
Obviously, it's not as big in Ireland. I played for the international team, which isn't much, to be honest, given the popularity and the size of the population in general.
Dude, that's still sweet, though. Are you kidding me? That's legit.
Yeah, I was pretty good. And then I guess when I started bodybuilding or started weight training, I started to get like kind of too heavy for like my size. And then I started to get slower, and then I just kind of fell out of love with it once I got like into the more senior age where I got to travel more and you got to commit more to it. So that's how I found bodybuilding. But I've talked to a few others as well. Christopher Barakat, who was on a couple of weeks ago, and he's also played basketball. Pretty. I guess it's pretty big in America, right? So, it's unusual for me to speak to other people who like basketball, but when in America, it's pretty big. Actually, I was at a game last week. I was in Chicago, the Bulls against the Wizards. They're kind of two of the worst teams right now, though. But it was pretty cool. But let's get into it. So, Greg, what I wanted to talk to you today about was the difference in training for strength and muscular size. So basically hypertrophy. You got a really good article on your website. I'm not sure if it's on your Stronger by Science website. Is it on that site or is it on a different website? But it's
on Stronger by Science.
Yeah, it's a great article. Because I think when people get into training first, they think that getting bigger and getting stronger are pretty much the same thing, and both just happen in unison. And to an extent, right, they do. But what happens on, like, when someone's actually getting bigger, when a muscle is growing bigger, what's actually happening at that level, at a cellular level?
Well, so it kind of depends how far back in that stream of causality you want to go. Because, I mean, at the most basic level, or I guess like the most like immediate level, muscle protein synthesis exceeds muscle protein breakdown and does so cumulatively over time. And then muscles get bigger. Then obviously there's a lot of stuff upstream of that goes about, bringing about that imbalance between synthesis and breakdown. But yeah, I mean, that's like 90% of it.
I was actually reading something by Jordan Tomlinson recently, and I didn't get too in depth into it for whatever reason. Maybe I didn't have time or something. But he was saying that it's not necessarily true that we always want to be minimizing muscle protein breakdown. Do you know anything more about that?
Well, he could give you a much better answer than I could. So I mean, I read all types of stuff, but since I'm primarily a coach and since most of the content I put out is aimed at athletes and coaches, I don't go quite as in depth on the molecular stuff as someone like Jordan would, because he's a muscle protein metabolism researcher. But my understanding of that is that essentially you want some level of turnover. So not like if breakdown was always, say, 0, that could eventually lead to like the muscle would keep getting bigger, but it would kind of get dysfunctional over time. because proteins can just degrade, get damaged, and then they need to get broken down and replaced. And so like you need some level of protein breakdown going on, or that process doesn't occur. There's actually some interesting research that I don't think you should put too many eggs in its basket. But there was a study by YU from 2014 looking at like muscle fiber characteristics of drug-free versus steroid-using strength athletes, and basically found that the force output per unit of cross-sectional area of muscle fibers was considerably lower in the steroid users, with one potential explanatory factor being that if someone's on gear, they are like suppressing muscle protein breakdown really hard all the time. And so maybe like they're not able to replace some of those damaged and less functional proteins, whereas someone who's drug-free, they build less total muscle tissue, but muscle protein breakdown is doing a better job of kind of ensuring that the vast majority of the contractile proteins are intact and functioning properly. It's hard to say that is actually the cause. I know one of the other things you want to talk about is sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. And another potential explanation is, maybe the actual contractile proteins are working similarly well in both groups, but as fibers get bigger and bigger and bigger, they just naturally accumulate sarcoplasm at a slightly faster rate than contractile proteins. And so then you get a decrease in force per unit of cross-sectional area just because the density of contractile proteins is lower. So it's hard to say what the actual cause there is. But those are two of the leading hypotheses. The other one is that as muscle fibers get larger, they're not able to clear waste products quite as well. And so maybe they get a slight accumulation of phosphate ions within the fiber, which can affect calcium release and like the actual process of excitation contraction coupling, and thus force output, even if you have the same density of contractile proteins and they all in a vacuum would work well. Just a slight accumulation of phosphate ions could affect the contractile properties. Or, there aren't that many studies looking like comparing fiber characteristics between users and non-users anyways, so maybe they're just spurious findings from small sample research. Those are all possibilities.
Yeah, I think what I did read so far was kind of like you mentioned, the recycling, almost like, I dare to say it, autophagy, where basically like a cleaning out or recycling of old proteins that can be replaced by newer ones, which is obviously a very, very simplified breakdown of it. But when it comes to strength and size, so I guess with muscle size, we have like increasing of the myofibrils in size, but do we also have increasing in the number of myofibrils as well, or is it just the ones that we currently have just getting bigger?
Well, so you do have an increase in myofibrils. So not like muscle fibers themselves, but the little bundles of contractile proteins. So myofibrils can increase in size or increase in number within a muscle fiber. The more contentious question is whether you can actually get an increase in total muscle fiber number, or hyperplasia rather than hypertrophy. I kind of think you can, which I think is kind of a minority opinion. How much do you want to get into that? Because that may be too far into the weeds.
No, go for it. I mean, if you say it's a possibility, we want to know the answer.
Okay, sure. So the conventional view is that when humans increase in total muscle size, that is due to the individual muscle fibers themselves growing. Maybe there's some sarcoplasmic hypertrophy going on. Maybe it's all myofibrillar. And the myofibrillar hypertrophy could be due to a proliferation in the number of myofibrils per fiber, or an enlargement of the myofibrils within each fiber. But basically, each fiber is getting bigger, but you don't get more fibers. Conversely, one could take the position, and this is the minority position, that muscles do primarily grow through fiber hypertrophy, but can also grow through fiber hyperplasia, or in other words, basically gaining more muscle fibers. The reason that that is contentious is if you pick up any like undergraduate anatomy and physiology textbook or exercise physiology textbook, they'll tell you humans experience hypertrophy but not hyperplasia. But I think that that's a slightly unnuanced take, because it's not like there's strong evidence that humans can't experience hyperplasia. It's that it hasn't been directly observed. But it kind of goes back to the saying, like, in absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And so then you might ask, well, why hasn't it been observed? And the reason why is that you can't really assess hyperplasia without just like cutting an entire muscle out. So generally hyperplasia would be studied in animal models where, for example, you may have a mouse and you say train its hamstrings, or you train like one hamstring and the other hamstring isn't trained. And then after, 10, 12 weeks of training, however long you want to train this mouse, you kill it and cut its hamstrings off and pull all of the individual fibers apart. Or, well, you want to do that. You would just cut the muscle in half, put it under a microscope, and then just count the fibers in the cross-section and see, does the trained leg have more fibers than the untrained leg? And maybe there's just a side-to-side asymmetry in how many fibers they had, but if you do that with enough mice, you accumulate statistical power, and then you can see, like, hey, on average, we're seeing 10 to 12% more fibers in the leg that was trained than the leg that wasn't trained. Therefore, we can conclude with a fair amount of confidence that hyperplasia took place. And so there have been 3 different animal models where scientists have tried to measure hyperplasia. They've tried to measure it in mice, they've tried to measure it in cats, and they've tried to measure it in birds. With the mice and the cats, they essentially rigged them up to do something that would look very similar to the type of resistance training that humans would do. Like they can build a little harness and have them do like little mouse squats or like little cat squats. For the birds, they used a stretch model where birds have a muscle called, oh God, I haven't read this research in a long time. I think it's the latissimus posterior. So birds have 2 lats, whereas we just have 1. And so like they would hang weights on the bird's wings, which would put a chronic stretch on the posterior latissimus. And then like, after several weeks of that, they would find an enormous increase in fiber number, like 40% or more in at least one study. But even in the mouse and cat studies, which, keep in mind, those are mammals. They're fairly genetically similar to us. Even with like kind of normal resistance training in mouse and cat models, they were able to observe hyperplasia essentially anytime they wanted to try to observe it. There aren't a ton of studies on hyperplasia because the actual data collection would just be tedious as fuck. Literally, you have the cross-section of a muscle under a microscope, and you're counting tens of thousands of fibers one at a time. So it wouldn't be particularly fun research to do, which is why there aren't that many studies looking for it. But basically, every study that has tried to find hyperplasia has found it. So then the question is, is there a good a priori reason to think that wouldn't also apply to humans? And I don't think there is. I mean, maybe we're the exception, but I can't think of a strong reason why we would be. And there is also some indirect evidence for fiber hyperplasia in humans. So your tibialis anterior, like your front shin muscle, your non-dominant leg, the tibialis anterior just naturally receives more like stimulus in day-to-day life. So, if you're kicking a soccer ball or, you're throwing something and you're like landing on a leg after you throw, that's going to be your non-dominant leg. And so generally, like your non-dominant tibialis anterior, accrues slightly more stress in day-to-day life than your dominant leg's tibialis anterior. And so there was a study a while back, maybe like 2012, 2013, blanking on the author's name, but you could probably find it on PubMed without too much searching. But basically, they took people who I think died in car accidents, removed their tibialis anteriors and counted the fibers, and found that the human cadavers that they dissected had like 11-12% more fibers in their non-dominant tibialis anterior than their dominant side. And so, I mean, a possibility is just handedness is set in utero, and as fiber number is being set in utero and in early infancy, the body just has a way to make sure that the non-dominant side tibialis anterior winds up with more muscle fibers. Or I think the more plausible explanation is just through greater accumulated stress in day-to-day life, hyperplasia takes place and you wind up with more fibers in your non-dominant tibialis anterior. So, that's not causal evidence the same way we have causal evidence in birds and mice and cats. But I think it's reasonably strong indirect evidence. So anyway, I think hyperplasia takes place in humans as well. I would not even attempt to hazard a guess of the degree to which hyperplasia, like the degree of total muscle growth that is attributable to hyperplasia versus hypertrophy. But I mean, I think that the phenomenon itself takes place. And I wouldn't be shocked if it takes place to a non-negligible degree. And whether that is, it explains 20% of the total change in muscle size or 5% or 50%, I don't have a good guess. But I do think that skeletal muscle hyperplasia does take place in humans as well.
So muscle fibers are getting bigger, we know that for sure, and it's very probable that they're also increasing in number as well. So those that increase in number also get bigger.
Correct.
And we just need some subjects to tie weights to their arms for a couple of weeks.
and then conveniently die.
Yeah, and then cut their arms off for the name of science.
Yeah, you're going to have a hard time getting that one by an IRB.
Yeah, but that's pretty interesting. I mean, I've heard people talk about it, but like you said, even in textbooks, you don't really hear much about it because we just hear more about the hypertrophy rather than hyperplasia.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a much more well-supported phenomenon. And so a kind of interesting thing you see when you look at like kind of short-ish term studies, especially in untrained subjects, and honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this one, but oftentimes you'll see a larger increase in fiber cross-sectional area than in total muscle cross-sectional area in studies that measure both, which, I mean, if anything, is the opposite of what you would expect with hyperplasia. So I kind of think that if hyperplasia is taking place, it would be playing a larger role in more well-trained lifters. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure why changes in fiber cross-sectional area are larger than changes in whole muscle cross-sectional area. One potential reason why, this is the explanation I've heard the most, is so for anyone listening to this, if you don't know how people would measure fiber cross-sectional area, they basically take like a pretty thick needle. They use a local anesthetic on like your quad or your tricep or your delt or whatever they're looking at, generally your quad. Make sure it's numb, stick the needle in, and literally like rip out a hunk of flesh, which is, it's going to cause pretty substantial bruising. You're going to be pretty sore for a few days. It is non-negligible tissue trauma. And so one of the potential explanations is there is there is some degree of evidence suggesting that basically the fibers on like the outside of a muscle are more active than the deeper fibers in a muscle. I think that's like fairly old research, so I wouldn't feel confident associating that with a particular researcher, but that's something that I learned in undergrad, which I haven't seen anything refuting. But anyway, if that's the case, potentially your fibers closer to the surface would be undergoing larger adaptations than just kind of your average muscle fiber. And so biopsies don't go super deep into the muscle. Because like
understandably,
like God forbid you go too deep and like hit a bone or like hit a nerve, or like hit a blood vessel. That would be catastrophic. So anyway, they're fairly superficial biopsies, and so if the superficial fibers are undergoing larger adaptations than the mean fiber, that would explain why fiber cross-sectional area does seem to increase faster than full muscle cross-sectional area generally in the research. But I don't think that that's super well understood.
Yeah, I think we got a good enough understanding so far, and thanks for your explanation. So when we kind of know now how muscles get bigger, but through the mechanisms, I suppose we've traditionally thought of muscle hypertrophy happens through three mechanisms. So muscle damage, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and then mechanical tension. And what's your kind of thought or most recent stance on those three elements of hypertrophy and how much each one of them actually lead to hypertrophy?
Did you mean metabolic stress, not sarcoplasmic hypertrophy?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. So I think... So I'll start with muscle damage, because I think that's, at least to me, the most contentious one. So essentially, like, early research tended to find that training modalities that caused more muscle damage also tended to cause more muscle growth. And so and there were some plausible mechanisms by which damage could influence growth. So having like a robust enough local inflammatory response seems to like improve the subsequent like hypertrophy signaling. But anyway, it was mostly based on studies finding that like types of training that tend to cause more muscle damage also tend to cause more growth. Maybe that's a potentially causative mechanism. But then the issue is generally you're going to get more muscle damage from higher volumes and higher intensities, and maybe like eccentric overloads. And eccentrics cause growth, higher volumes cause more growth than lower volumes generally. So like, that's two things can correlate without one causing the other. So
I've definitely seen some people who've taken that out of context and have done certain exercises like really heavy negatives only, or like certain exercise that causes a lot of eccentric load, like really heavy flies, but not doing the concentric part, or a ton of RDLs or something like that are just gonna cause a ton of soreness. I don't know if there's any correlation between muscle damage and soreness, but I'm pretty sure there is.
Well, I mean, theoretically there should be. The relationship between measured muscle damage, so like actually taking a biopsy and looking at something like Z-line streaming, and soreness is kind of weak in the literature. But I think that the studies that examine that question probably use the wrong statistical models, because soreness is a fairly subjective thing, right? So on a scale from 1 to 10, something that you rate as, a 4 if you're super tough, I may rate as 9 if I'm a pussy, so yeah. that would weaken the strength of that relationship. Whereas if you used, say, like a within subject correlation, you may find stronger relationships there. So I do think I do think that the relationship between damage and soreness is probably stronger than some of the literature would suggest. But yeah, so the question is like, soreness or training that causes a lot of soreness also tends to be pretty good for growth, but is the soreness / muscle damage like causing the growth? And studies that have been designed to look at that more directly tend to suggest probably not. So, for example, I think probably the best designed studies in that area, essentially, so one of the things that you see looking at a lot of different research is that essentially if you just have 1 or 2 weeks of fairly easy training, it mitigates a dramatic amount of the muscle damage that you get from subsequent hard training. So this probably isn't something that most of the people listening to this podcast can go out and experience for themselves. But if, say, there's someone listening to this podcast who's never lifted weights before and you're considering lifting weights, I
highly doubt that's the person, but anyway.
Well, and if so, I've probably lost them by this point. but if
I'd
you're
be
still
so surprised if you haven't.
But if you're still here, if you do just like 1 or 2 weeks of really easy training, so the types of protocols used range from, say, like sets of 10 at 30% 1RM to like 70% 1RM for like triples, but like still super, super easy, super far from failure. If you do that for like a week or two, then if you go into like hard training, the amount of muscle damage you accrue and the amount of soreness you get is cut dramatically, like 70-80%. And so there have been studies that essentially take that approach where one group just jumps straight into really hard training that's going to cause a lot of muscle damage and a lot of soreness. And the other group basically gets a week or two of lead-in training that's quite easy, and then they ramp their training up. And from like that point on, they do the same training program. So it's essentially one group starting a training program with a lot of soreness and muscle damage, and the other group essentially experiencing none or very, very little. And in those studies, you tend to see both groups have pretty similar training outcomes in terms of strength, hypertrophy, everything across the board, which I think very, very strongly calls into question how much muscle damage contributes directly to hypertrophy. I do think that there is a case that could be made that muscle damage may potentially become more important for hypertrophy again as people become more well-trained or like quite highly trained. And
Hey, Greg, I think I lost your mic there. You just jumped out.
I'm still here.
Did your mic disconnect? It's really low or something.
No.
It's like really muffled and I can barely hear you.
How's
There
it
we
now?
go.
Huh,
Yep.
that's weird.
So where were we?
Okay.
I think you mentioned you're just talking about the study of they've had pretty similar hypertrophy response from those who did like an introductory week or two.
Yeah, so
versus
I think that for like kind of beginner to intermediate lifters, muscle damage doesn't really directly cause or relate to hypertrophy at all. But I think a case could potentially be made that it becomes more important for like really, really highly trained lifters again. So there is a concept called myonuclear domain theory. So essentially, muscle fibers are like each muscle fiber is just one really, really big single cell. Most of your cells are quite small, but like a fiber from your sartorius could be half a meter long, which is wild. And so most cells in your body only have one nucleus, but your muscle fibers have like multiple nuclei. They're one of, I believe, 2 multinucleated cells you have. The other one is a rather large immune cell. So anyway, there is a theory called myonuclear domain theory that basically says the size of a fiber is ultimately going to be capped by how many myonuclei it has, how many nuclei are within the cell, where essentially each nucleus can, like for lack of a better term, oversee a given amount of volume within the muscle fiber. So you can kind of think of it like a Wi-Fi router, where each router can kind of extend the Wi-Fi signal to a given area, and then if you get outside the area, you can't connect to the internet anymore. So you can kind of think of myonuclei as the same way. So each nucleus is going to integrate information and produce RNA to create the proteins for like a given amount of volume for a muscle fiber. And then as the muscle fiber gets bigger and bigger and bigger, you'll reach a point that if it continued getting bigger, it would have more and more area that wasn't covered by each one of those routers, by each one of those myonuclei. And so to keep getting bigger and to be able to create enough proteins to keep growing larger and larger, it needs to be able to add more myonuclei. And so myonuclear domain theory is the idea that there is a cap on how large a fiber can get, kind of like a ratio of fiber size to total myonuclei. And so one of the things I think is interesting to think about is like why people stop growing in the first place. Because like we do. And I don't think there's a great explanation for it. And so one potential explanation is maybe as you become more and more well-trained, you just run into issues being able to accrue more myonuclei in your muscle fibers. And so if that is the thing that is capping growth, there's some research suggesting that you get more satellite cell activation and more myonuclear accretion under conditions of muscle damage than you do, under conditions of like just normal muscular tension without a fairly robust damage response. So if that's the case, then one could argue that maybe muscle damage becomes more important again for really, really high level lifters who are very close to their genetic limits for hypertrophy. I don't know that that is the case. So I used to be pretty confident in that idea, and these days I'm a little bit less confident in it. But it is still kind of an idea kicking around in my head that's maybe worth considering. But anyway, for most people listening to this, muscle damage isn't something you really need to worry about as far as when it comes to muscle growth. So then
it's pretty interesting, just on the muscle damage, or you mentioned about like what actually stops people from growing, because like I suppose a lot of the time people just don't lift long enough, but it does slow down. But if you think about like, let's say like pro natural bodybuilders who are in their 40s or even coming to their 50s, if they'd never ever used steroids before, then all of a sudden, and I haven't made like any visual or meaningful progress in 10 to 15 years, but then do their first steroid cycle, they are going to add muscle, like again, even up to 20 pounds of muscle. So it's pretty intriguing. I've never really thought about it, like what's actually going on there. I think people would tend to think, well, he's not gaining any muscle anymore because he's in his late 30s or 40s and now his testosterone is lower. But it seems like that's not always the case, because there's more going on than just hormones.
Yeah, so that's a whole different can of worms.
Yeah, we won't go there.
We could be here for another hour with me just sharing hot takes about potential mechanisms that constrain hypertrophy. But yeah, so moving on to tension and metabolic stress, I personally think that, so first part, which is not what I personally think, it's what there's very clear evidence supporting, is that tension seems to be by far the most important factor. But then, so there's basically two schools of thought on this. One is that tension is the only thing that matters. And if you expose a fiber to enough cumulative tension, that will cause the growth response. And, maybe you're going to accumulate some metabolic stress in the process of accruing enough cumulative tension. Or there's research indicating that as you accrue metabolic stress, the recruitment threshold for muscle fibers goes down, so you can recruit more fibers and create more tension. well, not create more like maximal tension, but create tension in more fibers. So some people then argue that like metabolic stress only matters insofar as it helps you create tension in more fibers. The other,
To take it one step back, Greg, when you're talking about tension and metabolic stress, will you break that down for us in terms of tension? You mean like increasing load over time, whether that's like actual weight or just total amount of weight lifted? And then metabolic stress would be like the increasing of the metabolites in the muscles, right?
so it's kind of hard to say. So with tension, it's hard to know what the like tension growth relationship is. So I think it's more of like a threshold based thing where as long as enough tension is created, you trigger the growth response. Because you tend to see pretty similar muscle growth with loads ranging anywhere from about 30% of your max up to about 85% of your max, give or take. And then as it gets even heavier, where theoretically you're creating even more tension, per set hypertrophy actually drops off. And then if you go too light, you're probably not creating enough tension. So if you're training at like 20% of your max. But yeah, so I mean, muscular contraction, that results from your sarcomeres shortening and pulling on each other and creating tension within the muscle. And you need that to kick off the processes that eventually lead to muscle growth. So there's essentially proteins like on the surface of muscle fibers that hook up to the extracellular matrix surrounding the muscle fiber, and they are sensitive to tension. So like when the fibers contract, it's called focal adhesion kinase. It kind of like feels the pull between the fiber and the surrounding connective tissue matrix, and that kicks off what's called the mTOR pathway. So that starts like the initial stages of that, the end result being in a ramping up of muscle protein synthesis. And so, yeah, it seems like you need an adequate level of tension to kind of kick that whole thing off, but it's questionable how much tension that actually requires. So some people
I think you probably got to balance the time under tension by not going too heavy and doing too little reps, but also then the magnitude of load so that you're just not going way too light, so that you have enough stimulus in terms of overall load.
Yeah, pretty
proximity
much.
to 1 rep max or whatever.
Yeah. So then the only other question is whether metabolic stress plays some sort of independent role, or whether it's just like it helps tension proceed. And I'm kind of the opinion that it does play an independent role. So for one reason, like I mentioned before, if you go too heavy and you can only get like 2 or 3 reps per set, it seems that growth on a per set basis does drop off, even though tension is higher. So I think that basically, I think that metabolic stress kind of has like a threshold type thing going on, the same way that tension does, where, you know, if maximizing metabolic stress probably isn't necessary, but if you're not accruing enough metabolic stress, you're probably not going to be able to maximize hypertrophy either. But I mean, implementation is pretty dead simple, really. So as long as you're doing sets of somewhere between like 5 or 6 reps on the low end and like 20-30 reps on the high end, and you're going pretty close to failure, you're fine. And then just have some means of progressing over time. So, you know, whether that's sticking with the same load for a while and trying to do more reps per set as your strength and strength endurance improve, or whether that's trying to do the same number of reps per set and going up in load as you're able. Essentially just trying to match the load you're presenting to yourself with your expanding physical capacities as your muscles grow and your strength increases. I think you're pretty much in the clear.
Yeah, I think with the more research that comes out, it's more evident that if your goal is hypertrophy, we can get away with a lot more styles and rep ranges and even loads for training, and you'll get pretty much the same results if you're just consistent and progress some form or another over time. But I mentioned a little bit earlier about the sarcoplasmic growth, and I guess traditionally, like in the muscle mags and stuff, you would have read, like from the bros or whatever, that higher reps will create, more sarcoplasmic growth, so basically giving you like a fuller look or a accumulation of things like glycogens and the likes in the muscles. Is that true, or is that something that's a misconception?
So it's hard to say. The research on sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is simultaneously really old and also in its infancy. And so by that I mean it was first observed a long ass time ago, like back in the 50s or 60s. But it's not something that has received a lot of research attention. So even though it was first observed a long time ago, there's still only like 5 or 6 studies looking at it. So essentially what we can say is that there's pretty good evidence that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is a real phenomenon that can occur. And what we can't say is kind of like what increases your odds of it. So it very well may be that the bro like gym wisdom is completely correct, and that doing like low loads, high reps, short rest intervals will cause a disproportionate amount of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. I kind of think that if that turns out to be the case, it wouldn't be a tremendously large difference. Reason for that is there's been some research, mostly out of Stu Phillips' lab up at McMaster, that finds that like after like a single training session of higher lower load training, so like 80% 1RM versus 30%, the actual myofibrillar muscle protein synthesis, so like synthesis of contractile proteins, increases to a similar degree. So, maybe over time there's a slight difference that kind of like accumulates, and the low load, high rep stuff maybe will cause a little bit more sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. But I'm not super confident in that. One of the things that we see in general is that there's at least indirect evidence that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is kind of just potentially a side effect of muscle growth, period. So one of the things that you see if you look at like single fiber research, so there's research looking at fiber cross-sectional area versus fiber force output. So you can essentially like peel away single individual muscle fibers and hook them up to a force transducer to see how much force like an individual fiber can produce. And what you see is that bigger fibers produce more force than smaller fibers, but smaller fibers tend to produce more force per unit of cross-sectional area than larger fibers do, at least suggesting that as fibers get larger, the amount of contractile proteins per unit of volume goes down, or in other words, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is taking place. So it very well could be that, like, just in general, as muscles get bigger, they gain more contractile proteins, and their sarcoplasm increases in volume, and the increase in the volume of the sarcoplasm just slightly outstrips the increase in contractile proteins over time, such that by the time a fiber has grown, like by the time a fiber's doubled in size, say, maybe the amount of contractile proteins, rather than doubling, has increased by 80%, and the sarcoplasmic volume, instead of doubling, has increased by 120%. So it very well could just be, kind of regardless of training style, some degree of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy may take place over time. But like I said, it's one of those things where, at least in my opinion, we have enough research now to be quite sure or quite confident that it is a thing that can occur, but the details are still pretty hazy. Yeah,
so I guess if you want to kind of get your your best bet is probably to have at least some variation in the rep ranges, or perhaps maybe introducing some intensity techniques or shorter rest periods, either whether it's like a block periodization or just some days that you do higher rep work with shorter rest periods, or even towards the end of the workout. You're not going to do yourself any harm anyway.
Yeah, I very much agree with that.
So then when it comes to like strength, if you just anecdotally observe people in the gym, or say bodybuilders, it's not always the strongest guys in the world that are the biggest guys, nor are the biggest guys always the strongest guys. However, the big guys are still quite strong. So what is the difference between training for strength and then training for size? So like Kai Green, right? He's huge. He's also very strong, but he's not like a world champion powerlifter. So what is the differences there between, is a bigger muscle just a stronger muscle, and is that all that matters, or is there more to strength than just pure muscular size?
I mean, it really just kind of comes down to whether you train with heavy load, so like 80-85% of your max or above, often enough to develop a lot of skill with heavy loading. So interestingly, I think this is pretty cool. So there's a lot of research now comparing the strength and hypertrophy effects of high load and low load training. High load, generally like 75-80% of your max or so, and low load, generally like 30-40. And so in those studies, hypertrophy is similar with high load and low load training, as long as sets are taken to failure or close to failure. Changes in dynamic strength, so like 1 rep max strength, is greater with high load training, which is what you'd expect. The loads are more similar to what is actually being tested. And yeah, like you probably need to go heavy to increase your 1 rep max. But the very interesting thing is that in the studies that test isometric strength, so just taking skill completely out of the equation, and you're just contracting as hard as possible into an immovable resistance, they find that actually the just sheer ability to produce force is similar with high load and low load training, which suggests that like the actual, ability of the muscles to contract and produce force is kind of just dependent on muscle size. But then there is the skill element of being able to put that to use in a dynamic exercise to post a good 1 rep max number. And so I think, so another thing you see when you look at populations who do train for strength, so you can assume that everyone is, if not similarly skilled, at least quite highly skilled. So like, national and world-class powerlifters or weightlifters, they find that there's an insanely strong correlation between muscle size and 1 rep max strength. So there was a study by Brachua and Abe that came out, I think in like 2004, where all of the subjects were like elite national world-class powerlifters. And they found some just ridiculously strong correlations between lean body mass and various measures of muscle size and strength in the squat, bench, and deadlift. So like the correlation between squat 1 rep max and fat-free mass per centimeter of height was like, it was like an R value of above 0.9. The R squared was like 0.83. Meaning that like 83% of the variance in squat strength could be predicted by how jacked someone was. So if you ran a similar study on a more heterogeneous population, so you have some powerlifters and then you have some sedentary people, you'd get a much, much weaker correlation because you would have a pretty big dispersal of how much skill was present for the lifts being tested. But when skill is more or less equally accounted for, bigger people lift more weight. And so, comparing someone like Kai Green to, say, Blaine Sumner, I wouldn't be surprised if Blaine Sumner actually has more lean mass than Kai Green does, just because he's like a foot taller and probably 100 pounds heavier. But even if one assumed that they had a similar amount of lean mass, if all else was equal, if Kai said, I'm done with bodybuilding, I'm going to be a powerlifter now, he'd be lifting, I would predict, something reasonably close to world record weights within like 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask you. I was about to say, if like obviously skill is a huge component of it, right? So you, just because you're big, you're not going to be that strong, like because you got to do it. Like my squat, I don't squat that often. My legs are quite big, but I'm not that strong in it because I don't do it. But if Big Ramy was to like say, and for anyone who doesn't know what Big Ramy is, he's pretty big, hence the name. But if he was to do just like go to powerlifting and just start back squatting all the time, do you think that he would be like extremely strong and be breaking world records? You pretty much answered it for me.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, there are differences between people other than just how much muscle mass they have. So, maybe you have more or less favorable muscle insertions. And one thing worth noting is that favorable muscle insertions for bodybuilding aren't favorable muscle insertions for powerlifting. So for bodybuilding, essentially you want your muscles to insert as close to your joints as possible, and you want your tendons to be as short as possible, because that's going to give you big, full, crazy looking muscle bellies that just pop on stage and look super impressive. For a powerlifter, you want muscles that insert further, and as far as inserting close to a joint goes, that makes your joints look smaller, which therefore makes your muscles look bigger. For a powerlifter, you want your muscles to insert further from a joint. That gives them more leverage at the joint. That's simultaneously going to make the joint look bigger and therefore make the muscle look less impressive, so it would be bad for bodybuilding. And you also want the tendon to be longer, because that's going to be able to store more elastic energy, which may not be that helpful for a deadlift, but for like a bench or a squat where you have to reverse the weight, a longer tendon, better ability to store elastic energy is going to be beneficial. So with someone like Big Ramy, I don't think he actually has that favorable of like insertions and muscle bellies for bodybuilding. Like his physique doesn't look, it doesn't pop in a bodybuilder-y type way, the same way that someone like Phil Heath does.
It isn't that the cloud look. He's like a cloud.
So someone like Big Ramy, maybe he has muscles that are better for powerlifting. Maybe he should give it a shot. Whereas someone like Phil maybe wouldn't be that great of a powerlifter, just because even though he has so much muscle, he wouldn't be able to use it quite as efficiently for lifting max weights, just because like the shape of the muscle and the insertions wouldn't be quite as good. But yeah, in a general sense, if you assume two people have a similar training background, they're similarly well trained, their muscles are similarly good for the sport, their insertions are similarly favorable, they're built well to get in the right positions for the lifts, etc., the person with more muscle is going to be stronger. But then, obviously if someone trains like a bodybuilder and doesn't lift heavy all that often, they're not going to have as much skill at performing really, really good 1-rep maxes. And so then their strength would be less if they step foot on a powerlifting platform. But if you got them in an isokinetic dynamometer, they very well may be able to produce more knee extension torque than a powerlifter who squats more but has less muscle mass, which would then suggest if that bodybuilder trained for powerlifting for a couple years, they would probably be quite good at it. And I mean, there's plentiful examples of people who got their start in bodybuilding or like just hypertrophy style training and made kind of the shift over to powerlifting and did quite well. Probably the most well-known example is Eric Spoto, guy who previously held the bench press world record at 715. He he was just like a guy that just trained to get big. And he posted a video of him doing like benching like 600 for 6. And people were like, holy shit, this guy's strong. Fly him out to super training, have Mark Bell teach him how to actually bench press like a powerlifter. And then like 3 months later, he breaks the world record. There's a guy who trains at the gym that I train at, Jamar Royster. He placed third, I believe, either second or third at USAPL Nationals this year in the 83 kilo class. I was at his first meet. He came in, just didn't look like anyone else. He was like, I mean, all the rest of us were powerlifters, and he was clearly a bodybuilder. Super muscular, didn't seem super comfortable with the power lifts yet. I knew his coach a little bit, so I chatted with him. I was like, hey, what's Jamar's background? Chatted with Jamar a little bit. Turned out he'd only been training for powerlifting for like 3 months, and I think finished second for best lifter at that meet. And within like a year was top 10 in his weight class and is now top 3 in his weight class, like 3 years into the sport. But since he came from a bodybuilding background, dude just had a shit ton of muscle and filled out the 83 kilo class better than 99% of people fill out the 83 kilo class. So yeah, I mean, like, just because a bodybuilder doesn't lift as much, say, today as a powerlifter who's the same size as them or even smaller than them, most good bodybuilders who have a really good muscular base would be quite good powerlifters if they trained for it.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So basically what you're saying is once skill is at least taken care of, so after an initial couple of years of training, right, you're going to maximize skill, not 100% obviously, but with more basic lifts, like let's say not Olympic weightlifting but like powerlifting, right, that it really comes down to then muscular size. So that renders the question that if your goal is pure strength and you've been lifting for a couple of years, it's probably better to do more hypertrophy based training. So it might be increasing volume in addition to just strength training, rather than just strength or say powerlifting style training only, because the biggest determining factor of your progress or your strength increases at that point is going to be muscle size.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think a lot of powerlifters hold themselves back because they don't commit to just like. So I mean, the thing is, as a powerlifter, if you're doing like off-season hypertrophy training, like you come from a bodybuilding background, so this may not compute with you. Like you may think, oh, heavy triples for 8 weeks, I would hate that. We think like sets of 6? What the fuck is this? That's cardio. But you know, like generally, you're not going to be able to build muscle that efficiently doing doubles and triples all the time. And so if we want to drop back and build a muscular base, that means taking some weight off the bar, doing more reps, probably doing some more sets. And like, that's just not what we like to do. You know, in my opinion, that's not fun and engaging training, but it's useful and necessary training. And so, yeah, I think a lot of powerlifters don't do enough of that, and find themselves in a weight class that is below where they probably should be. They never fully fill out their frame and are thus less competitive. But I mean, ultimately, you know, it's a hobby. No one's making a living off of powerlifting. And so if someone's willing to sacrifice a little bit of their potential in order to just enjoy their training day in and day out more, like I'm not gonna hate on them for it. But yeah, I do think that a lot of powerlifters would benefit from doing more dedicated hypertrophy work.
Yeah, so it comes back kind of to what we talked about earlier in terms of hypertrophy, that we can pretty much say that all rep ranges and intensities, not all, but a lot of them are equal if we're not going too low on the, let's say, I think it's some of the meta-analyses show below 4 reps and up to around 30 reps. So the only real reason that like somebody who is purely focused on getting stronger would be doing those lower rep ranges would be for that skill aspect, because you accumulate more volume more efficiently in the higher rep ranges, and muscular size is going to be, after a certain point, the only, or not the only, but the main determining factor of getting stronger. So the only reason you would actually be doing those lower rep ranges is for the skill element of it. Is that correct?
Yeah, for the most part.
And is there any like neurological adaptations that occur, or do they kind of accumulate as you've been training for a while, or does it make a difference if you're doing lower reps or higher reps?
So that's a good question. So I mean, improving skill is going to be largely neural. Like that's going to be something that kind of takes place everywhere between your primary motor cortex and your cerebellum all the way down to your muscles. Like that's a coordination game. So that would be a neural adaptation. And then like beyond that, so some of the basic things you'd learn in an ex-phys class, like better inter and intramuscular coordination, decrease in antagonist coactivation. Like I'm sure some of that stuff is taking place as well, but it's just not going to be nearly as important as just building muscle and generally getting good at the technique.
I got you. So then, final question for you, Greg. With regards to hypertrophy, at least what we know is that you need to be improving or increasing training volume, some form or another over time, to an extent. I guess it's not always the case because then the oldest guys would always be lifting the most, which isn't necessarily true. But when it comes to strength, is it the same case? You need to be increasing training volume over time, but just in those lower rep ranges?
It's tough to say. So I kind of think that volume across a training career kind of takes one of two trajectories. So if you're someone who's just wired to where you have to put everything possible into every set you do, I think that from like the beginner stages of training to like intermediate stages, so when you've been training a couple of months up to a couple of years, volume is probably going to naturally need to progress over time. So volume in terms of like sets per week. And it's probably never going to need to get anywhere crazy, but it is probably going to have to trend up over time. However, I think that past a certain point, it starts like gradually eking back down again, just because like the amount of stress you can put on your body in a given set goes up so much. So if your max set of 5 squats is 150 kilos versus if it's 300 kilos, those are two very different things. Like it could be a similarly challenging set of 5. Like it could be 5th reps a grinder. No way in hell you could have got a 6th. You rack it. The 300 for 5 is just different. Like it's a different beast. And so like, I kind of think that past a certain point, which is kind of difficult to define, you have like a disproportionate increase in stress accumulation per set, and so volume would start trending down again. So that's one direction things could take. The other direction things could take is if you're someone who does kind of prefer to leave a couple more reps in the tank, then volume can stay high or maybe possibly even increase over a training career. So if you're doing, say, triples and leaving 3 reps left in the tank, even if those triples are quite heavy, since you're training submaximally, it's not going to take quite as much out of you. And then maybe you can keep progressing volume across a training career. That's kind of the Shako model of lifter advancement. And so I think there's some degree of path dependency there, like which one of those paths you take. And it's going to depend somewhat just on the style of training a particular lifter enjoys and finds the most palatable.
And do you think that might be one of the reasons why people actually start to see less muscle gains over time as they age, simply because they can't get the same ROI on the volume that they're doing? Like, let's say you're 45 years old and you just can't get any more volume in because you can't recover from it anymore. Therefore, that perhaps slows down progress.
That's a possibility. I don't think that's the main driver, though.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Greg, for coming on today. You've been a wealth of knowledge, and I'm definitely going to be listening back to this one a few times myself because I learned a lot.
Thanks for having me.
So where can people find more about yourself?
So if you want to check out the free articles I write, they're at strongerbyscience.com. If you want to check out the podcast that I am a temporary guest co-host on, that is the Stronger by Science podcast. You can find it wherever fine podcasts are found, on our YouTube channel or at sbspod.com. If you want to follow me on social media, I'm probably most active on Instagram. My handle is just at Greg Nuckols. And if you want to check out the research review that I put out every month along with Eric Helms, Eric Trexler, and Mike Sordos, that is called MASS, or Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. You can find that at strongerbyscience.com/mass.
So I hope you enjoyed that episode with Greg Nuckols. I certainly enjoyed recording it. Greg, like I mentioned in the opening, is just a fountain of knowledge, especially when it comes to things like training, because that's where he's really passionate about. I didn't realize how much hyperplasia had a role to play in overall muscle size, so it's interesting to see or listen to Greg's perspective on that. I also learned a lot about how actually getting bigger plays a role in getting stronger. I knew that it had a role, quite a big role in the past, but I didn't realize that, the main driver beyond skill acquisition is really only going to be hypertrophy. So if your goal is to get stronger, obviously you're going to want to be doing those lifts that you want to get stronger in, but for the most part, doing some form of bodybuilding training or training to get bigger is going to be the driving factor or determining factor when it comes to getting stronger. So if you want to learn more about Greg, do follow him on the social profiles that I mentioned earlier. And if you want to ask me any questions, you can get me on my email address in the show notes. Like I said, I'm not really using social media at the moment. I will be in the future, but not right now. So just send me an email in the show notes. And please do share this episode with friends, family members, distant relatives, whoever you think will benefit from this. And again, any ratings or reviews on iTunes or Spotify or YouTube or whatever you're listening would do the world of good. So that is it for this episode, and I look forward to chatting to you in the next one.